The war in Vietnam at the beginning of 1967 suffered from several problems. The Johnson administration had imposed tight restrictions on Rolling Thunder, the bombing campaign on North Vietnam, didn't allow the army to block communist infiltrations in Laos and Cambodia, and never tried to mobilize American society. The result was a war of attrition with no apparent progress. This led to myths, like the idea that the war itself was a mistake, that the United States were beaten by communist guerrillas, or that General Westmoreland was incompetent and didn't understand the war. In this video, we'll see how the war was actually improving in 1967 and 68, how the Têt Offensive exacerbated the misperception, and how the Johnson administration completely failed to seize opportunities. American support for Saigon depended on the South's democratization. Saigon went from a military junta to a constitutional republic without much trouble, thanks to Ky and Thieu. There remained power struggles with the General's Directorate, but they managed to reach a compromise and adopt a new constitution on March 18, 1967. It created 3 branches of power, with 2 legislative chambers, and enshrined the principle of a republic with rights and freedoms. Hanoi wanted to extend the bombing halt in 1967 by cultivating American intellectuals and journalists opposed to the war. Alison Salisbury of the New York Times, for example, went to North Vietnam, was told that American airplanes deliberately bombed civilians, and swallowed this propaganda without question. In reaction, academics called for halting Rolling Thunder, and Hanoi was very glad with the result. The North Vietnamese minister Nguyen Duy Trinh said at the Politburo that a bombing stop would be a military gift. President Johnson sent a personal letter to Ho Chi Minh for a diplomatic opening, but the North Vietnamese leader answered with propaganda accusations. Johnson decided for a return to bombing with a modest rise. The American left, notably Robert Kennedy, abundantly condemned this. In April, pilots gained approval to harass enemy airfields, but not directly attack them. When they noticed that an airfield near Hanoi wasn't getting targeted because there were Chinese and Soviet personnel on the ground, the North Vietnamese put their best planes there. Already in 1967, the North's anti-air system was better than in Germany in 1944, notably with 200 radars, modern fighters, and anti-air missiles. Because the American government decreed forbidden areas along the Chinese border and around Hanoi, the North Vietnamese put most of their defenses there out of reach. 1967 saw the most air combat of the campaign, and with hard blows like in Operation Bolo, the North sent their planes to China. Disagreements on the bombings led to hearings in the Senate, and McNamara lost his infallibility aura. The secretary lied several times by distorting statements by military leaders and pretending they were in perfect agreement with him. The war was intensifying in the South. Westmoreland still focused on enemy bases, logistics, and protecting pacification areas. The first enemy of 1967 was the Iron Triangle, a communist fortress near Saigon. In Operation Cedar Falls on January 8, the Americans went all in. In tunnel networks, the tunnel routes found almost 500,000 pages of documents, as well as means of communications, lists of spies in South Vietnamese forces, and thousands of tons of rice. On February 22, near the Cambodian border, Westmoreland launched Operation Junction City, the largest at the time with 22 battalions, and the enemies withdrew to Cambodia. 6 days later, the North Vietnamese initiated their spring offensive, but lost 2,768 dead during Junction City and ended up stopping large unit attacks. Because of South Vietnamese leadership problems, the Americans had to take a larger part in village protection, which in part encouraged RVN leaders to procrastinate. With all this, Westmoreland asked for reinforcement to reach 550,000 men in total, with 678,000 to be optimal. With criticism of the war by the left of the Democrats and by people like Martin Luther King, Johnson again refused to directly explain the war to the people and asked the MACV commander to get back to the United States and do it in his stead. The war's opponents like Senators Fulbright and McGovern, as well as media commentators, criticized the general. The president was being pressured in attacking sanctuaries in Laos and Cambodia. Thieu and Ky asked him about this in Guam, Admiral Sharp talked about it in the Senate, and on November 24, former President Eisenhower publicly spoke about it, with support from former General Bradley. The only result was a letter sent by the State Department to Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia, who replied there were no foreign troops on his land. In Saigon, Thieu and Ky were proud of their accomplishments, notably by decentralizing authority to a more traditional village-oriented manner. Still, the rural development program was not going as fast as planned. For pacification, Johnson agreed with Comer's advice to create a new department named Corps. An intelligence program was established to track down communist cadres and other subversives. It would later be called Phoenix Program. It would include surgical strikes on communist leaders. The main problem for pacification remained the lack of South Vietnamese leadership. There was heavy fighting in the First Corps region. NVA death estimates for the month of May were 6,119 for the region and 9,808 for the country. American deaths reached 1,000 for the first time that month. Ellsworth Bunker would replace Lodge as ambassador on April 5. He was hardworking, resolved disputes, and had a more open mind than Lodge, but also arrived without real comprehension of Vietnamese cultural characteristics, such as the importance of prestige and dignity. There would be presidential elections in South Vietnam, and Key and Thieu would run together. Thieu, himself a soldier, was now against military meddling in politics and ran as a civilian. South Vietnam seemed better, with military victories and an increase in economic prosperity. The election of September 3, 1967 completed the transition from a military regime to a democracy. Despite a deteriorating relation, Key and Thieu again escorted their country through difficult moments. The government worked to protect the vote. Despite communist attacks which killed hundreds of voters that day, participation was 83%. Thieu and Key won 53% of the vote. Thieu would be president with a symbolic role, while Key as vice president would again hold real power. There were also legislative elections which didn't go in favor of candidates backed by the two men. For the first time, the country's social groups didn't vote uniformly according to their community interests. The Second Republic was born on October 31, 1967. Thieu swore to defend the Constitution and declared, "From the moment I take the oath of office, I belong to you." Prime Minister Locke's cabinet only included 3 military officers. The Americans expected quick change right at the beginning and put pressure, but the new government and assembly lacked experience, and you had to go slowly to break the old power system with the generals. The American press, notably Peter Arnett, criticized the RVN's performance and said it let the Americans fight. The journalists did not understand that combat mostly involved American troops because the communists wanted to inflict them losses and force a favorable peace, and that the RVN specialized in pacification. Very few American journalists spoke Vietnamese and would go visit RVN units. Westmoreland often reminded them of Southern victories. There was also a tendency among journalists and experts to publish content which generalized a specific situation to the entire country. Meanwhile, the Americans knew the North Vietnamese were preparing an offensive for the summer from the DMZ, but Westmoreland wasn't authorized to send troops there. During a visit at Con Thien, he was asked by a Marine, "General, I lost my best buddy to incoming yesterday. Why can't we go into the DMZ after those bastards?" Several Americans killed near the zone had been executed at point blank and had their genitals cut and put in their mouth. In the 3rd Corps, the 7th and 9th NVA divisions attacked the 1st US Infantry Division by targeting small units, but suffered large losses. Despite continuous defeats, Lidwan and General Tan were in favor of continuing the offensives, including the next planned for January 1968. In the US Congress, there were more and more opponents to the war. There was an increasing gap between liberal elites and American workers, who had often served in preceding wars, were proud of the American forces, and weren't keen on those who burned draft cards and waved Viet Cong flags. Even the president ended up for the first time giving a press conference on the war and declared there was never such a good harmony and cooperation between the administration and the military. The American anti-war movement was gaining momentum, notably on campuses, with teachers increasingly on the left. Some were opposed to the war by general pacifism, or specifically this one. A big cause for the opposition was the diminution of draft exemptions, with students absolutely wanting to avoid military experience. We often hear that most of those who were conscripted were uneducated, poor, and colored. This was far from reality, and in fact 2/3 of those who served in Vietnam were volunteers, twice as much as for the Second World War. Some, like the pediatrist Dr. Spock, gained media attention by saying that the North Vietnamese meant no harm to the US and only wanted to defend their country. He ignored Hanoi's rhetoric, which said, "The Vietnamese Revolution is a component of world revolution and its successes have never been separated from the ladders," and that the enemy was American imperialism. Johnson was losing popularity by refusing to comment on demonstrations. He again asked Westmoreland and Bunker to come and talk in his stead. North Vietnam was severely hit by the bombings. The country was nearing famine and dependent on importation from its allies. Le Duan later admitted that without help, they could have lost. US intelligence didn't know about this, and McNamara kept saying that bombings didn't really impact the North and wanted a halt. On October 23rd, Johnson approved Rolling Thunder 58, an intensification authorizing new targets, notably the Fuyan Air Base. More than 246,000 tons of munitions were dropped on the North in 1967, almost twice as much as in 1966. The Communists brought over 25,000 tons of supplies to the South in 1967. In the biggest battle of the war yet, 4 NVA regiments left Cambodia to charge toward Dak To and establish an ambush on favorable ground. Their plan was revealed to the Americans by a deserter on November 2. During the next weeks, there was hard fighting, especially on Hill 875. Northern General Han had to withdraw on the 22nd by lack of supplies, with 2,188 killed for 283 Americans and 61 South Vietnamese killed. In December, in the village of Dak Son, the Viet Cong attacked with flamethrowers and burned to death 252 villagers. For the Americans, there were also disagreements on counting communist losses, especially with the question of who was a combatant or not, and accusations against Westmoreland spread to the media. Enemy combatants in the South in 1967 went from 290,000 to 262,000, and their losses were 88,000 killed, 32,000 severely wounded, 18,000 deserters, 7,000 prisoners, and 24,000 non-battle losses. According to official North Vietnamese history, recruiting in the South was only 7,600 in 1967, which didn't account for political cadres and guerrillas, which would raise the total by 36 to 60,000. Control of the population by the Communists went from 5.6 million to 3.4 million. In the North, Minister Tin made a speech on December 30 saying Hanoi was open to negotiations in exchange for the end of bombings. In private, this was propaganda to give a good impression, but many in the West really believe it was an opening. There was an emerging break between the President and the Secretary of Defense, and it was decided McNamara would leave in February for the World Bank. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong suffered enormous losses with no real gain in the last years, but remained motivated. Even Giap, who wasn't for large offensives, seemingly didn't care about losses, saying, "Every minute, hundreds of thousands of people die all around the world. The life or death of 100, 1,000, or tens of thousands of human beings, even if they are our own compatriots, represents very little." Le Duan wanted to break the dead end with a new approach, a massive offensive to prompt oppressed masses to rise and unify the country under a communist banner. The Politburo approved Resolution 14. The new plan for reaching for victory was a bet based on 5 assumptions. The United States wouldn't send more troops, Johnson wouldn't lift military restrictions, the 1968 US presidential election would push Washington to give up, the RVN wouldn't fight, and the people of the South would rise to support the communist victory. Assumptions on the Americans weren't far from reality, and those on South Vietnam were not illogical but would be completely wrong. The aim now was to attack cities, mostly with the Viet Cong. Guerrillas and political cadres would get out of hiding, which was completely illogical. American intelligence was often criticized for failing to predict this, but as they said, even with detailed plans, they wouldn't have believed it. It made no military sense to attack all urban centers with divided forces far from logistical lines. In the US, there was increasing doubt about the war's progress. The president and the military said the situation was going well, which was true, but progress was hard to follow. It wasn't a front line with visual progress like in World War II. The coming offensive would worsen this perception. The Viet Cong proposed a week-long truce around the Têt holiday, as in other years, and the Allies treated this with respect. Têt is a sacred holiday without equivalent in the West. Families pay tribute to their ancestors with celebrations. Têt is seen as a renewal, the opportunity to rest after a year's work, and thank the skies and earth for a good harvest. It's an opportunity for family meetings and giving the children new clothes. An offensive during the holiday defied reason. Even with information from deserters and informants, the Americans didn't take this possibility seriously. They thought the attack would be either before or after. The NVA massed 40,000 troops and lots of artillery around the base of Khe Sanh, defended by 6,000 Americans. Contrarily to a widespread myth, the attack on Khe Sanh wasn't only a diversion, it was a real attempt to take a base. Hanoi hoped to replicate the victory at Dien Bien Phu, but the Americans were in a much better position than the French, and Westmoreland had prepared plans for massive bombings in anticipation. In preparation for the urban offensive, 84,000 communist troops were infiltrated in cities, and with cadres, the total was 100,000 men. NVA forces were held in proximity for exploiting successes, and Communist forces were told they would be welcomed as heroes. Half the South Vietnamese army was on vacation, but with signs of the attack, Thieu agreed to put the 1st Corps region on alert. General Wei Yan reinforced Saigon and other cities, which probably saved them. The Communists were poorly coordinated. Some commanders only learned about the plan 2 days in advance, and on top of that, a change in the calendar wasn't sent to everybody, so some cities were attacked a day before the others. The Viet Cong began in part their offensive on January 30 on major cities of the country. Active RVN troops had to hold for the others to get back from holiday. Communist political cadres went from house to house to prompt people to follow them, and government workers met were shot on the spot. People refused to collaborate and preferred hiding, fleeing, and reporting them. South Vietnamese forces now fought to protect their loved ones. An American analysis determined that 141 out of 149 southern battalions had fought well, and 30 of them fought very well. Contrarily to the jungle, the Communists weren't on their ground and couldn't easily escape. Most attacks were crushed. Only in a few cases the Communists took control of city parts, notably by firing heavy weapons, or taking buildings hostage like the Vinh Long Cathedral. Destruction was unavoidable. Anti-war journalist Peter Arnett only mentioned destruction done by the Allies, not the Communists, and reported that an American officer told him, "We had to destroy Bentre in order to save it." For Americans unfamiliar with urban warfare, it looked like senseless destruction. The most important battle of Têt was the battle for Hue. Southern General Quang, one of the best in the RVN, held against Communist attacks with his slim forces. 10,000 Communist troops, mainly well-equipped North Vietnamese, attacked the city and its old imperial fortress. They managed to take most of it, but Quang's defense held the door open for retaking. Immediately, Communist agents who had established lists gathered government workers, soldiers, teachers, intellectuals, clergy, Catholics, and foreigners. Most victims were shot, others drowned, and many beaten to death to get information. The initial death number remembered by the Americans was 2,800, but mass grave discoveries later increased the total to 5,327. The Hue Communist Party Committee was proud to say Hue was the place where reactionary spirit had existed for over 10 years, however it took us only a short time to drain it to its root. The Hue massacre, almost unnoticed by the American media, was a major motivation factor for the South Vietnamese for fighting. For Quay Son, after a series of minor clashes in the surroundings, the North Vietnamese began a siege. The base was never really in danger compared to Dien Bien Phu. American air power hammered the attackers non-stop. The press and the president, however, rushed on the Dien Bien Phu comparison. Johnson became obsessed with it and followed the battle day to day. The war was now seen through the Quay Son magnifying glass, and they lost the overview. Saigon was hit on the 31st. The South Vietnamese and Americans worked day and night to take them out. Police Chief Loan, known for his crass personality but who led his men into battle, became a symbol for the entire wars. He was photographed while executing a prisoner with a bullet in the head. The picture contributed to turn public opinion against the war and gave South Vietnam an even worse reputation. The photographer regretted the picture and later defended Loan because the man was a combatant with no uniform who just committed atrocities. It's often said that an image is worth 1,000 words, but I would add to that without context, it isn't worth anything. Another well-known event was the attack on the American embassy in Saigon by Viet Cong commandos. 19 men attacked the embassy in the morning of the 31st and managed to blow a hole in the compound's outside wall. 5 American soldiers were killed, but the Viet Cong were all eliminated without penetrating the building itself. They, however, succeeded in their symbolic objective. The American press immediately sent wrong information saying the communists had captured the embassy. Even when they learned the truth, they often didn't publish corrections. The media perception of the battle was completely off, with journalists often unaccustomed to the local context. The Washington Post and Newsweek said that the Viet Cong's ability to penetrate Saigon was a sign of sympathy by the population and even from army units. That's like saying in 1940 that the French population was sympathetic toward the Germans. At the end of the first day of offensive, the North Vietnamese leadership's hopes were dashed. The South Vietnamese people uniformly refused to rise, soldiers returned from holiday and fought for their families and the government, and with communist forces spread in more than 100 cities and towns, they didn't have an advantage anywhere but in Hue. In Quay Son, American air power had wreaked havoc on northern attacks to the point where there were no attacks of importance. Communist troop morale was at a low point. By February 5th, the communists had been routed from Saigon. They could not execute the massacres they planned like for Hue. In every other city of the country except Hue, the situation was similar, with enemy forces beaten in a few days. Militarily, the situation was good, but from the Pues's point of view, he accused the military of lying by speaking of progress. Journalists like Carnot said the attacks had boosted the Viet Cong standing among the population and undermined the governments. Others like Walter Cronkite said the US should negotiate to get out of the war. These interpretations, with omitting the Hue massacre, give a completely skewed image of the battle. Meanwhile, Quang's 1st Division, other units, and American Marines would retake Hue. The Marines were well prepared for this type of combat and had to advance methodically, still with heavy casualties. At the beginning, they avoided using heavy weapons to avoid civilian casualties. The North Vietnamese were well entrenched in the citadel, and it was decided to use air and naval bombardments to take out the defenders. On February 23rd, the North Vietnamese commander ordered a retreat, but was harassed until it was out of reach. The Americans lost 222 dead and 1,100 wounded, the South Vietnamese 421 dead and 2,100 wounded, and the North Vietnamese 2.5 to 5,000 dead, plus 3,000 during their withdrawal. More than 1,000 civilians were killed and 115,000 became refugees. During the battle, the media only mentioned Marine efforts, even though the South Vietnamese had 3 times more forces. For Quai San, the NVA spent February regrouping, entrenching, and getting closer to the Marines to avoid bombings. Media cover of the battle was affected by the reaction to the Têt Offensive, with the garrison described as besieged and powerless, and journalists saying the North Vietnamese were close to victory. Johnson knew little about the war and was very worried. During the battle, more than 100,000 tons of bombs were dropped on a 5 square kilometer area around the base, making it the heaviest bombing in history for a battle. The largest attack on the base came on February 29, but the attacking regiment was decimated by steady fire from heavy weapons. On March 22nd, the NVA attacked Quai San one last time without success. 10 to 15,000 North Vietnamese were killed in the battle, while less than 500 Marine defenders perished. The Têt Offensive was an enormous military defeat for the Communists, but paradoxically a great psychological victory. The Viet Cong went all in and were decimated. Despite critics, Southern military and police forces generally fought well, with many losses, and showed offensive spirit by retaking captured positions, all while being mostly equipped with weapons of the last World War. Some elite units had fought with M16s, and the US began supplying more during the summer. The RVN's performance was uneven, with many soldiers still lacking discipline. Secretary of State Rusk said on February 10, with very few exceptions, South Vietnam troops fought with courage and persistence. Their record in the last 12 days should lay to rest once and for all the myth that the South Vietnam troops won't fight. There were several reasons for the communist failure. They attacked too many places at once, made too many tactical errors, their system was too rigid, and there were communication problems. The Allies were superior in technology, and helicopters allowed for reinforcing positions after victories elsewhere. The offensive mostly missed because the two communist assumptions, that the people would rise with the communists and that the RVN wouldn't fight, didn't happen. Numbers for communist losses remain controversial. If 3,700 Americans and 7,600 South Vietnamese lost their lives, around 45 to 54,000 communists had died. The NLF was profoundly weakened, and the government could mobilize the population and defense militias. In any case, Hanoi quickly replaced these losses by sending 141,000 men in the South in 1968. The American administration lost its nerve, and we witnessed a leadership failure. Washington had been destabilized. At the end of February, as planned, McNamara stepped down. He had been involved since 1961 in all phases of American intervention. His strategy of graduated response and his disdain for military advice got the fighting to this stalemate. He was unable to understand Hanoi's non-rational decisions and waged the war as the military advised, and ended up giving up. The country and the party were divided. Militarily, the situation for the Americans was better than before. Allied forces accounted for 525,000 Americans, 600,000 South Vietnamese, and 61,000 others. Everywhere in the South, Allied forces hunted enemies like never before since 1965, and in previously untouched places, communist opposition was diminished and their recruitment in the South would be very hard. Thieu wanted to take advantage and unify the South behind the war effort. The JCS, Westmoreland, Bunker, Sharp, and Rostow tried to persuade the president to initiate a strategic counter-offensive with bombings on the north, mining Haiphong, and land operations in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Polls showed that 61% of Americans were for a military escalation, a bit more than before Têt, but Johnson only authorized a small reduction in restrictions on Rolling Thunder. The military wanted reinforcements in Vietnam for exploiting the communist defeat, but this demand was wrongly perceived by the government and the public as a sign of a bad situation. The new Secretary of Defense Cleaver decided against sending reinforcements, and Johnson only added 13,500 men. He began to fear popular left-leaning candidates for the Democratic primaries like Kennedy. The real disaster for the South was the economic impact, with the destruction, reconstruction, and the loss of tax revenue. Hundreds of thousands of refugees had to be taken care of. While the US president concluded he should get out with negotiations, Le Duan in Hanoi wanted to repeat the Têt Offensive by again targeting cities. In any case, fighting would continue with infiltrated NVA troops. In March, South Vietnamese deaths were 2,500 compared to 1,543 for the Americans and over 17,000 for the communists. On occasion, Americans abused civilians, going from punches to gunshots, but military discipline and leadership remained strong and made sure it wasn't widespread. The Americans remained frustrated by the refusal of many villagers to reveal trap locations. Leadership was lacking on March 16 in My Lai. American troops of the American Division had to search the My Lai 4 and My Kie 4 hamlets. Lieutenant Colonel Berger told them that civilians were normally at the market and those who remained were enemies. An inexperienced platoon led by Lieutenant Calley landed there. Some armed men fired on the helicopters. American troops began a massacre on Calley's orders. Several soldiers refused to participate. Between 347 and 504 civilians were killed and around 20 women and girls raped. When learning this, Berger ordered a ceasefire. The division commander, General Custer, ordered an inquiry. Some of his subordinates didn't want this to get out, and the crime remained a secret for a year. Calley was finally sentenced for life with hard labor. In a pretty incredible manner, there was pressure in the US, including by Jimmy Carter, for pardoning him. Soldiers were ironically for a more severe sentence, while civilians were more divided. The massacre made the news for weeks, and rightly so, but it's pretty hypocritical when the Hue massacre by the communists, much larger and systematic, didn't get any attention. In Saigon, the Assembly passed Hughes' bill for a draft of 17 to 45-year-olds. Even if the South was not motivated to fight, Johnson didn't give this importance. There was change in the personnel, with William Colby replacing Comer at the head of corps, Creighton Abrams taking Westmoreland's place at the MACV, not by dissatisfaction as speculated, but because Westmoreland was due to rotate, and Clifford at defense like mentioned. Johnson didn't understand the situation in Vietnam and only saw a bloody stalemate. Clifford assembled a group of wise men, retired decision makers, and gave them a selection of pessimistic information. The wise men were divided, but Johnson had already made his choice. In a televised speech on March 31, he announced a restriction on Rolling Thunder to below the 20th parallel and called for negotiations. He declared he would not run for president at the next election. His approval rate was 26%. The Americans were not for a withdrawal and remained persuaded of the communist threat. The press didn't influence most Americans, except the liberal elites. Young men returning from the war gave a more positive outlook than what was given in the media. A Gallup poll in the spring found out that only 26% wanted to go there in the first place, but that 94% of those who returned were glad of the experience. Hanoi used a partial bombing halt to repair and prepare for the next operations. The winter of 67 and 68 had been bad for air operations because of bad weather and the return in strength of the North Vietnamese aviation, notably the MiG-21. If the anti-war left was glad of the limitation on bombings, they continued below the 20th parallel with more intensity. Doves in Congress said it would lead to nuclear war. In Hanoi, the president's speech was seen as a sign that the US was preparing to withdraw. Le Duan wanted to resume offensives. The leadership wrote, "Unless a major victory is achieved, nothing can be expected from diplomatic struggle. Diplomatic debate should be regarded as a means to confirm the enemy's defeat and our victory." Hanoi agreed to the negotiation offer on April 3rd. Too worried about getting abandoned by the Americans and was determined to give his forces more responsibilities. Military operations were intensifying at the same time, with Operation Tuan Tang leading to 7,600 enemy deaths. Quezon attackers were attacked by the Americans and South Vietnamese in Operation Pegasus, with 1,325 losses. In Asho, Northern forces were preparing to attack Hue but were prevented by Operation Delaware. Preparations for the second wave of offensive continued. Troops and officers were less trained, there would be no elements of surprise, but Leduan refused to consider objections by field commanders. There were leaks of the plans and troops had a hard time infiltrating cities, but the offensive was maintained. On May the 3rd, right before the offensive, Hanoi agreed to negotiate in Paris, giving the peace camp hope for a diplomatic opening, but for Hanoi, the timing was for the Americans to sign their capitulation. On May the 5th, 126 cities were struck by artillery, but only Saigon was attacked on foot. The second wave is often nicknamed Mini-Tet, but fighting was often more violent than the first. Hard battles were waged until mid-May, and the communists finally stopped attacking on June 13. According to communist sources, the second wave led to 32% of communist losses for the year, with 26,000 estimated deaths only in May. Many weapons caches and agents were found. American deaths in May were 2,169, a record for the war. There were 107,000 more refugees, which pushed the government's capacities to the limit. The second offensive didn't dissuade Johnson to pursue peace negotiations. He sent Averell Harriman to Paris at the head of the delegation. Harriman wanted to pull off a diplomatic exploit at all costs, even if it meant disobeying Washington's directives. The North Vietnamese in Paris only spoke about American aggression to gain more time to rebuild their forces. Quang, a very respected, humble and honest politician, was named Prime Minister. He targeted corruption and came into conflict with Key, who had a corruption network. Thieu in parallel was gaining influence. General Abrams, who stood out during World War II, became MACV commander on June 10 in a good military situation. He brought more troops near Saigon to stop communist mortar shelling. Contrarily to the myth, Abrams diverged little from Westmoreland's tactics in the first month. He also talked about attrition and preferred to attack enemies in far-off regions than wait for attacks. It was only when the threat of large northern units diminished that he focused more on pacification. In Hanoi, Leduan finally realized his mistakes and no, just kidding. He wanted a third wave of offensives, same as the others. The North Vietnamese at that point amounted to 80% of communist units in the south. Hawks in the United States wanted to do more against infiltrations, which were 14,000 men per month, but Harriman asserted that to the contrary, they should stop rolling thunder to dissuade the North Vietnamese from attacking. As Abrams pointed out, the bombings held 80,000 NVA soldiers in the north, and in reality the impact on the North's war effort was even greater than he thought, with a large part of the logistics destroyed. The third wave began on August 17. Communist forces had been monitored and didn't penetrate the cities. In the Mekong as well as in Da Nang by My Thuot and Quang Nai, the attacks were quickly defeated. The South Vietnamese were performing increasingly better, and from August 18 to the 29th, estimated northern losses were 8,500. Tan Bac Dong, at the time a high-ranking officer in the Southern Communist Forces, said it was an enormous mistake which led to the loss of almost all the liberated zone. On August 20, world attention turned to the invasion of Czechoslovakia by 20 Soviet divisions to topple the government which deviated from Moscow's line. The Chinese condemned this, and other communist countries were divided. North Vietnam supported Moscow without hesitation and declared the invasion was a legitimate and essential action which symbolized such noble principles as to protect by all means the socialist bloc and the socialist revolution. China began to see Moscow as a bigger threat than the United States and began to withdraw its support troops from North Vietnam. In the United States, candidate Humphrey tried to seduce the anti-wars by saying that if he was elected, he would stop bombing North Vietnam. The left of the Democrats asserted that the NLF was independent from Hanoi and there should be a coalition in Saigon including the communists. The North Vietnamese feared Republican candidate Nixon and his anti-communism. The Soviets even offered money to Humphrey's campaign, but he refused. Nixon was strongly for the war and said it saved the region from communism, notably Indonesia. He was for intensifying bombings on the north and on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He remained willingly vague on his intentions and plans for Vietnam to avoid revealing his intentions and tying his hands. In anticipation for negotiations, Q worried that the Americans would stop bombing right before the elections to favor Humphrey, which is exactly what happened, and saw that Nixon would be better for the South. Washington agreed on October 27 a North Vietnamese offer to begin negotiating on November 2 in exchange for stopping the bombings. Q wanted to delay this, and the problem took a new dimension when there were signs of collusion with Nixon's team to delay negotiations. I'll talk about the Cheno affair in the next video, but Q didn't need the Nixon campaign to tell him that the bombing stop would benefit Humphrey. Johnson was practically threatening the South Vietnamese president by telling him he would be responsible for preventing peace and that Congress would remove its support. Q ended up responding to Ambassador Berger, "I would ask you a frank question. To have a peace, an honorable peace after 20 years of war, why are you in such a hurry for a day or two, while the communists took more than a month after the partial cessation of bombings in last March to come to Paris, and then spent 5 months to read the same speech at each session? This conference will decide the fate of my nation. We need time for that. If your government says no to us and decides it has no more time, it's up to you. But I have my responsibility to my nation and my people. I have to do that to have a tranquil conscience." In Operation Rolling Thunder, from March 1965 to October 68, there were more than 306,000 sorties, 30% of the total for the war during the same period. 881 aircraft were lost in the north, including 112 by anti-air missiles, 50 by planes, and 719 by ground fire. 588 crew members were killed. Restrictions and self-imposed compromises made that useless. Johnson announced the bombing stop on October 31 for the next day. His speech indeed led to a rise in support for Humphrey, who became tied with Nixon. On November the 3rd, Ho Chi Minh declared on the radio that this was an initial victory against the war of aggression of the American imperialists, and that the North Vietnamese people should show its determination in liberating the South. On November 5, Nixon nonetheless won the election with a slim margin. The South Vietnamese were glad, but not the North Vietnamese. At the same time, Le Duan finally decided to give up urban offensive in favor of prolonged attrition with low-cost guerrilla. He even admitted he should have listened to Giap, who advocated for this since 1964. The Americans and South Vietnamese now focus more on pacification to adjust to this new situation, with the North Vietnamese being a smaller threat. On November the 1st, the Accelerated Pacification Campaign, or Le Hoi in Vietnamese, was launched. The South's regional and popular forces would establish outposts and patrol. These territorial forces would now benefit from American advisors, M16 rifles, and new commanders. With security, the government could re-establish administration, hold local election, organize economic development, and establish self-defense units. But after the election, Johnson's men were arguing on terms. Harriman and Clifford were for forcing a coalition government in the South and removing American forces without reciprocity from the North. They didn't really talk about the consequences of their proposals, and Harriman even said that the Soviets would prevent communism from spreading in the region. In Paris, representatives from both Vietnams gave enormous importance to small procedure questions to avoid losing face, mainly the shape of the negotiation table. In Vietnam, the NVA continued to violate the DMZ and kill Americans, but Abrams didn't get permission to pursue them either. Nevertheless, quick military progress allowed for re-implementing territorial forces and civilian administrators faster than expected. Propaganda teams and the amnesty program Chu Hoi led to a rise in communist desertions, with 2,269 in November and 3,148 in December. Communist losses in the war up to that point are difficult to estimate, but in April 1969, Giap confirmed in an interview that it lost around 500,000 men. At the end of 1968, there was still no agreement on procedures to begin negotiations. The North Vietnamese were not in a hurry, now being in prolonged war, and neither were the South Vietnamese, awaiting Nixon's arrival in the next year. Southern forces were improving in quantity and quality, and faced young, inexperienced North Vietnamese soldiers with no connection to the South's people and culture. There are several controversies and myths that I must talk about to conclude. General Westmoreland's performance remains controversial. Most people say he did a poor job, didn't understand that the war was an insurgency and not a conventional war, and didn't give enough importance to pacification. As we saw, this wasn't the case. He understood the situation well and did the best he could with the constraints. I won't go into too much detail due to lack of time and because I'll make a video on him. He was, however, guilty for predicting several times that the enemy would be out of men and depended enormously on firepower for operations. Some say that negative media coverage was a leading factor in American failure. Giap even said that his most important guerrilla was the American press. In short, no. The big reason for the loss of popular support was the political constraints on the war which guaranteed the lack of progress, but the media were a factor. The press mostly followed political tendencies in the US. There was also a quick quotation rate for journalists who didn't know the terrain or the war itself and lacked context. There was a representation problem because there was no real media coverage in North Vietnam, and journalists were not interested in South Vietnamese troops and didn't go visit them. As we saw during Têt, sensationalist reports were published without fact-checking and concentrated on destruction images. Television loves shocking images, and for Quezon, for example, journalists all posed in front of the only plane on fire on the base. But the media weren't a source of problems by themselves, rather a reflection. One characteristic of the war in Vietnam was the size and intensity of the anti-war movement, which was complex and with several sources. There were idealists who said American values were corrupted by the war, isolationists, pragmatists who didn't believe in a possible victory, but many leaders of the anti-war movement were militants of the New Left who hated their country and brandished communist banners. Students were told that the United States were waging a war with cruelty and interfered in a civil war. A major cause of opposition was also the decrease in exemption for the draft, with students wanting to avoid military experience at all costs. By 1967, there were intense movements with buildings taken over, which often repulsed people, but it attracted attention on the war, which Johnson didn't want. The leading cause was LBJ's policy of minimizing the war, which led to incomprehension of objectives and costs, resulting in a credibility gap. We have the image of hippies with flowers, but by 1969 buildings were destroyed, people were taken hostage, and there were even bomb attacks. In reality, opposition to the war in the population is overrated. Polls show that most people were for continuing, either by giving more responsibility to the South or intensifying efforts. In any case, the North Vietnamese saw the demonstrations as proofs of American weakness to exploit. On the American side, atrocities were an aberration and a systematic tactic for the communists. Perception was the opposite, with My Lai very well known and Hue forgotten. From 1958 to 1966, the communists assassinated 61,000 government workers in the South. They often committed terrorist attacks and fired rockets at cities, but with movies like Platoon, which feature cases of American abuse, we keep this image. We also have an image of undisciplined and drug soldiers, but in reality, there were no more AWOL soldiers than in Korea, and drug use was less than in the US. They weren't depressed or pessimistic either. A 1968 poll showed that 94% of those who returned from Vietnam were glad of the experience. In a 1980 poll, 82% of veterans said the US didn't win because soldiers were too limited, and 66% said they would do it again. For the famous fragging, we'll talk about it in the next video. There's a myth that African Americans had a disproportionate casualty rate. In reality, of those who served in Vietnam, 88% were white and 11% black. Of 58,128 deaths, 87% were white and 12.5% black. At the end of the war, they represented a smaller proportion than their share of the population. Otherwise, we have the famous herbicides, especially Agent Orange. In Operation Ranch Hand from 1962 to 1970, 90 million gallons of herbicides were spread to clear areas and remove cover for the enemies. The operation was stopped due to toxicity reports, but had contributed to saving troops by preventing ambushes. There is still a controversy on side effects on humans. There are some studies that show that cancer rates among crew members who did the spraying were not abnormal. In the summer of 1965, the North Vietnamese army was on the verge of destroying the South Vietnamese army and communize the country. American intervention prevented that. For 3.5 years, both sides fought to precipitate a victory, leading to heavy losses. North Vietnam failed in its attrition strategy until 1968 and in urban battles during the rest of the year. The American strategy of attrition didn't break Hanoi's will. American attrition of NVA forces was as bloody as most wars, but made sense. It prevented North Vietnamese initiatives, diminished Hanoi's capabilities, and reduced its access to southern villages. With a return to guerrilla by the communists, the South had additional time to reinforce itself. Nation had options Johnson had rejected, so sending troops in Laos and Cambodia, resuming bombings on the north with less restrictions, invading the southern part of North Vietnam, or simply threaten to invade, destroy dikes, or use nuclear weapons. There was pressure by intellectuals and elites for a withdrawal, but the majority of Americans didn't want a precipitate withdrawal. Johnson showed a lack of leadership. American administration support for the war lacked in some instances, like the Buddhist crisis, Johnson's refusal to follow military recommendations, and lack of communication by the White House. Despite this, at the end of 1968, South Vietnam seemed destined to become an anti-communist stronghold like South Korea. The next video will be about the period from 1968 to the fall of Saigon in 75, so stay close, you can like and subscribe, and I'll see you around.